Format for today will be I'll do a short introduction, then I will do some Q&A with Secretary Johnson, and then we'll open it up for audience Q&A, and then we'll do a wrap-up. So we're really excited to have the Honorable Jeh C Johnson with us to help us help leaders lead through the crisis. So here's what we're going to do today, again, very briefly. And final opportunity to engage in the polling. So go ahead and finish that poll while you're reading the goals and agenda. Okay, this is our team at Strategic Leaders Academy. All of us are former senior military leaders. So we've got Eric Coburn, Nicole Kaus, myself, Jeff Marquez, John O'Grady, and Tom Lucier. So all former senior military leaders. All of us have led soldiers, sailors in combat, in crisis, in peacetime. So, I mean, we know what it's like to make decisions that affect the lives and livelihoods of real people. And we know what it's like to make those kind of decisions when oftentimes there aren't any right answers, and in the midst of really difficult situations, and quite frankly, to live with the consequences of those decisions. And at the same time, to learn and grow and do better, get better each day. So we know what it's like to be in your shoes. And we bring about 150 years, not just of experience, but of success. All of us have advanced degrees in subjects ranging, associated with leadership, culture, and strategy. And we've already helped our clients grow by $25 million and counting. And so what we've done is taken all of that knowledge and background and experience, and through a lot of study and training have turned that into knowledge and practices that are relevant for businesses and nonprofits and government. So this picture we took at Normandy. We're going to start off with some pictures. So I just ended the poll. And overwhelming, oh, this is interesting. So overwhelmingly, the participants said that planning for the future amidst uncertainty is your #1 leadership challenge. So I think we'll get into that a little bit today. But first, we're going to see how you're doing. So what picture, I'm going to show a bunch of pictures next. What picture best describes what you're going through right now? So take a look at these pictures and take a few seconds, and in the chat room, please keep your microphones off. In the chat room, go ahead and type in the picture that best describes how you're feeling right now.
What?
Okay, I see we've got some responses coming in. Oops, I'm sorry. Okay, Nicole, tell us what folks are feeling.
We've got mountain peaks, the octopus, gears, alarm clock. A couple of people are mentioning the snow-covered mountains and the octopus. Different signs pointing different directions, fish.
Okay, so octopus feel like you've got to be able to do 8 things at once, things pointing in multiple different directions, a lot of uncertainty, climbing mountains in the midst of all of this crisis. So I appreciate everybody's engagement on that, and we'll go through this again at the end of today's session. One of as we looked at what makes major crises unique, we studied the bubonic plague and the Spanish flu and the post 9/11 and the financial crisis, and each of these major crises had a life cycle that had 4 distinct phases. So there was a react phase where governments were doing massive interventions with stimulus, broad policies, et cetera. Those decisions often made with very limited, sometimes bad and conflicting data. And so you had a lot of sort of major corrections, major changes. And over time, as data came in, then they began to adjust, refine those decisions. Instead of major interventions, you now had fine tuning going on. And when the fine tuning was complete, you began to get into a new normal where people were just managing in a different context. And then finally, you were able to prosper. And one of the things that we noticed was also there's a difference between leading in the crisis and leading through crisis. So leading in the crisis, kind of like looking down at the pothole, which you see at the bottom. So part of the challenge is, where are you looking? And if you're leading in the crisis, you're sort of looking at the pothole. And imagine if you're riding your bike and you're going towards a pothole. And if you stare at the pothole, you're going to go right into it and faceplant. If you look to where you want to be, then you'll find your way around the pothole and get to your destination safely. And that's exactly what we're trying to help folks do. So the white line here represents what the government's doing. And one of the things in a major crisis is governments and others are making decisions that are affecting your business. You've got no control over those decisions. In a minor crisis, you control the variables. In a major crisis, you don't. And that's what makes this such a challenge. And so the folks in the yellow line are businesses, leaders that are staring at the crisis just a little bit too long and don't pivot in time. And so they require major interventions, major investments in capital, bailouts, et cetera, to prosper in the new normal. The ones in the red line are the ones who just never quite make the adjustment at all, or don't make it successfully. 1.8 million small businesses after the financial crisis of 2008 failed because they couldn't make the adjustment. Of course, where we want to be is looking through the crisis, keeping an eye on the future, and that will help us stay at or above the green line, where we are seeing the pivots very quickly. We're able to get successfully into the new normal and prosper. So leading in the crisis, like I was a junior officer once, and I stayed up for like 4 days straight during a crisis because I thought I was indispensable. And I kind of looked like the person on the lower right. And I learned through that experience that actually what you have to do is lead through the crisis, create a sustainable rhythm, clear, regular communication, strengthen your culture, extend your runway, and be able to pivot successfully and learn to be more like the person on the upper left. And so that brings us directly to somebody who I know leads quite well through crisis because I have seen him do it. And that is the former Secretary of Homeland Security, Honorable Jeh C Johnson. So we first met when he was the Department of Defense General Counsel. And you were there for from 2009 to 2012 with Secretaries Gates and Panetta and Hagel, and then became the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security from December of 2013 to January of 2017. Mr. Johnson is currently a senior partner at the Paul Weiss, which is a law firm in New York City. Regularly appears on NBC, CBS, ABC, MSNBC, CNN, Fox, etc. And he has been the general counsel of the Air Force and an assistant United States attorney in the Southern District of New York. Mr. Secretary Johnson is a graduate of Morehouse College and Columbia Law School. So welcome, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you very much, Chris. A couple of minutes ago was an excellent illustration of leading us through crisis. You handled it just fine. You kept your head and forged through it. Congratulations.
Thanks. Always have those frictions during a crisis. So what in that bio what did I not mention in the bio that you would like to highlight?
Model trains. I love model trains. I have HO scale trains set up in my basement. It's the Northeast region looks like northern New Jersey. I live here in Montclair, New Jersey. I love trains, but in my time in the Department of Defense, I did have the opportunity, being the senior legal official there, to work with some extraordinary leaders with a number of different leadership styles in the United States military. And that goes from the 010 to the 06, 05 level. And Chris, I would include you among them. And from that experience, working with senior members of our military, as well as Secretaries Gates and Panetta, I learned a lot about leadership through crisis. You know, we'll get into this at greater length, but lesson number one is somebody like the President of the United States hires you to be a leader, not to emulate somebody else, but largely to be yourself, rely on your own instincts. So it's incumbent upon everyone to adopt a style and a manner of leading that best suits themselves. Over.
And so you've been through a lot of both short-term crisis and long-term crises, and you both handled them yourselves. You've seen other leaders handle them. So in these kind of long duration crises, what are some of the unique challenges that leaders face?
3 golden rules, in my opinion, leading through crisis and perhaps even leading through normal times. The exemplar for leading through this crisis, in my opinion, has been Governor Andrew Cuomo of New York. New York is 12 miles from where I sit here in northern New Jersey, and between New York and New Jersey, we are the epicenter of the current crisis right now. Nobody blames Andrew Cuomo for where we are, but everyone credits him for doing his best to lead us through it. And he's doing so not because he has all the answers, but because he's providing clear, consistent communication to the people he serves about where we are and what we need to do going forward. He's been doing so on a daily basis. No one detects any ulterior motives in his communications and in his messages, and he's just very clear. And a lot of people give him credit for that. And so I think being consistent, being consistently visible, and being clear in your messaging is critical as a leader. Number 2 is an inclusive decision-making process. Secretary Gates taught me that if you are inclusive in who you consult about making a major decision, everyone you consult may not agree with the decision, but they will feel at least like they were heard and are therefore more likely to respect and support and help you implement the decision you make. And it's important to populate your inner circle of decision makers, whether it's through crisis or in normal times, with people of divergent points of view, those who are more risk takers, those who are more cautious, to help you see through the dynamic of all of that, and those who have just different points of view. And then 3, never ask someone to do something you wouldn't do yourself. And I know this is true of you, Chris, but in my view, if the people who follow you see that you would never ask of them something for which you would not make the sacrifice yourself, that gives you much more credibility to lead. So for example, a couple of summers ago, when we had the crisis on the southern border and the current administration began separating children from their parents, one of the ways I knew I would never have done the same thing is because I knew I could never bring myself to ask someone in ICE or the Border Patrol to take a child away from his or her mother. So never asking of your workforce, those you lead, to do something you wouldn't undertake yourself is also critical. So those are sort of my 3 golden rules.
So clear communications, inclusive decision making, and in the military, what we call setting the example, or never asking somebody else to do what you wouldn't do yourself. So on
one of the things that for which I got the most credit when I was secretary, which I did not expect to be such a big hit, is one day I played undercover boss, and I went to BWI and I put on the uniform of a TSA officer and worked the line for a couple of hours, and it went viral on Twitter. The workforce loved it, to see me passing bins, wearing the uniform, wearing the badge, and so that's what I mean.
So so let's just take each one of those, and as for the audience, again, just a couple of ROE. Please keep the microphones on mute. Please keep your cameras off, and if you've got a question for Secretary Johnson, go ahead and type it in the chat room, because we're going to get to your questions in just a second. So let's drill down a bit on each one of those. Clear communications. There are leaders, governors, business leaders on all sides of the aisle who are communicating very clearly and very precisely, and but others who are engaging in some bad practices in terms of communication. So what are some things to avoid when you're communicating with the workforce during a crisis?
Don't communicate your daily musings. Don't communicate internal deliberations, which will end up appearing to and sounding like wildly inconsistent messages about what it is the people who follow you are supposed to be doing. Be clear, be consistent, but also think carefully about what you are going to tell others and how you are going to do that. Without thinking, well, it's Tuesday, I'm thinking this, but and then you end up saying something completely different the next day because you didn't have an opportunity to really think through the problem. So that's certainly something to avoid.
And how about on the second one? So I was talking with our SLA team earlier today, and we were wrestling with this same issue of how do we help people strike the right balance, because everybody wants, I think, inclusive decision making, or any sort of, I think, leader worthy of the name wants to be inclusive in decision making. How do you strike the balance between just including everybody and creating chaos, or creating a chaotic method, and on the one hand, avoid that on the one hand, and on the other hand, potentially missing key points of view. So how do you strike the right balance between sort of chaos and exclusivity?
Good question. You can't have a decision-making working group of, say, 30 or 40 people. That's just too big. It's important, first of all, that you create the right environment for people, say in a group of 5 or 10 or 15 or 20, or you're in the situation room, 12 plus a lot of plus ones. Create an environment where people feel that their ideas and their viewpoints and their advice will be welcome, even if you don't agree with it. And I have to say that's something that President Obama was very good at. He would ask the people at the table, plus the people on the back wall, what they thought, and would acknowledge an intelligent point of view, even though he wouldn't agree with it, to encourage people to provide their best advice. And out of that comes healthy decision-making. And so very often a dynamic is created where people decide there's more cost than benefit to me personally by offering a point of view that may be a minority point of view in the room. So they just stay silent. And that's not a healthy decision-making environment. And then second, inherent in any group of advisors or a cabinet or a group of assistant secretaries, there will be people who are risk takers. There will be people who are more conservative, more risk adverse, more people who are more conservative, more people who are more progressive, people who are steeped in the bureaucracy, people who have more of an outsider's perspective. And it's important to populate your group with a representative array of all of the above, which can be achieved, in my opinion, with a group as small as 6 or 7, or, if need be, a group as large as 12 to 20. But I think it's so important that you have a mix of advisors who are going to represent the more cautious side versus the more aggressive side, and know who they are. And out of that, I think you get the best advice. When you get a group that's way too large, people tend to posture, they're shy, they're worried about retribution from some of the other advisors in the room. But so something smaller is for the senior most decision-making process is going to be warranted. But again, you really do have to create the right environment for that. One of the leaders I admired most when I was at the Pentagon was someone I think Chris, General Carter Ham, who was commander of U.S. Army Europe, and then he was commander of U.S. AFRICOM. And Carter used to say to his JAGs, I'm instructing you to tell me anytime you think I'm doing something that is in the yellow zone or certainly the red zone. Your job is to let me know when you think I'm doing something that gets chalk on my shoes out of my lane. And that sets the environment for the right kind of advice. Over.
So one more question from me, and then we're going to turn it over to audience questions. I think we've got some populating already. So how do you create an environment? What do you do to create an environment in which people are willing to offer dissenting views, or people are willing to offer views that maybe stray from the norm? Because the risk, of course, as you mentioned, is somebody will offer a different point of view, or one that's maybe more critical, or suggest a different course of action, and can get cut off at the knees, and then suddenly they're not going to provide any more ideas or any more suggestions. So what are some steps that you take to create an environment where people are comfortable expressing?
Well, best I can do to answer that question is tell you what I actually did. So at DHS, we'd have a lot of discussions around immigration enforcement, and my two, and I'll provide names. My two go-to people on immigration enforcement were Kevin McAleenan, who was the #2 person at Customs and Border Protection, who later, after I left, went on to be the commissioner of CBP and then acting secretary of DHS himself, and Tom Homan, who was the head of enforcement and removal activities at ICE, who retired and went on to be a Fox News commentator. And they were my two go-to people on the enforcement side, who would give me the career official's point of view, who would give me the implications of any decision we make, and would reflect the mindset of somebody responsible for border security. Okay, now because immigration is such a heavily politicized issue, and because you're going to make somebody angry no matter what you do, and because there really is a whole nother point of view from the migrant side of the equation, I had also at the table Esther Oliveria, who was one of my senior advisors, who very much identified with the immigration reform community. She was Ted Kennedy's chief immigration policy advisor for years, and I had the benefit of her advising me. And I would tell Esther, I'd hear from Kevin, I'd hear from Tom, and then I'd look to Esther on the other side of the conference table, and Esther, tell me what you think. And I would tell her, both privately and in front of Kevin and Tom, your job is to tell me the other side of the equation. And I empowered her to do that. And Tom and Kevin understood that was her role. They respected her point of views like I did. And it was hard for Esther, but she knew I was counting on her for that. And that was the environment we created. And I think it worked well. And there was no other way I was going to be able to navigate that very, very contentious, difficult issue without having those points of view. And I think everyone in the equation respected each other.
Fantastic. So Nicole, excuse me, could you grab 2 or 3 questions for Mr. Johnson?
Sure. Our first question is from Adrienne, and she asks, how do you unify or reconcile people with diametrically opposing views, which may be based on their role? So, like, for instance, right now we're seeing in the news this being played out between scientists and economists regarding the COVID crisis.
I'll go back to what I said before. I think it's important that people feel heard in the process. If they feel heard, if they feel like the decision maker understood the point of view, asked questions about it, and incorporated at least some of that point of view in the ultimate decision, you'll very often strike the right balance, and people will feel like you very often struck the right balance. So and that's how I'd come at that question. You know, where I'm part of this working group here in the Northeast region, advising the various governors on how and when to reopen our economy. And that is exactly what we're talking about. It's striking a balance between the health community point of view and the business community point of view. And to go about that task, I know we have to hear from both camps. And I want them to know, and I'm sure the governors want them to know, that we are listening to both camps.
Great. And Nicole, could you just take 2 more questions? Ask them both from the audience.
Okay. That was the last question that we had.
Okay. All right. Super. Final words, Mr. Secretary, on final words of advice for leaders.
Final words of advice. We are, as leaders, and I assume I'm talking to people mostly in the private sector and the business community, in a time like this, first and foremost, we are responsible for the welfare, well-being, safety, physical safety of the people who work for us. And, you know, like the skipper protecting the crew. And people will remember how you led during this time of crisis, and they will credit you for having done a good job by them during the depths of this crisis once it's all over. So that's my final thought.
Great. My colleague, John O'Grady, one of our SLA owners, talks about people are kind of like on a bell curve. And during this crisis, the people at the tails of the curve are the ones who are going to be remembered the most. So the ones who are, you know, either on the very toxic end of that tail, we're going to remember them. But we're also, more importantly, going to remember those who really went out of their way to make an impact and do something special. And I appreciate what you have done and continue to do to make a positive impact on leaders in our country. And thanks for being with us today.
All right, Chris, thank you. Appreciate you having me on.
Absolutely. So we're going to wrap up here. So the next question, and this is for everybody, is we're going to go back to those pictures. So what picture best describes your top takeaway from today? So go ahead in the chat room, exercise those chat fingers. What picture best describes your top takeaway from today?
I have a feeling this is my evaluation.
Okay, so go ahead and populate the chat with that picture, and if you want, go ahead and leave a little descriptor too about why you chose that particular picture. All right, and Nicole, do we have? I think we've got some things populating in the chat.
Yeah, a number of people are saying that just seeing things more clearly, just lots of insight that that Secretary Johnson provided, the light bulb and the sun, the future is bright.
Well, I think you have given people hope, Mr. Secretary, and exactly what why you've been such an extraordinary leader in both the private and public sectors. So I think that's a 2 thumbs up from the audience. We've also got a number of resources for leaders if you lead through the crisis. One of those is our crisis life cycle webpage, which we have put together. So all of our webinars, all of our articles about how to lead through the crisis are there on that web page or on that page on our website. Now, we've also put together a course called Leading Through the COVID-19 Crisis, how you and your team sustain high performance. And the course is 7 modules, and it really takes you step by step. So module 1, step 1, build trust, communicate clearly, strengthen relationships, exactly some of the things that Secretary Johnson was discussing, create a sustainable rhythm, focus, eliminate distractions, and boost your creativity. Step 4, increase your engagement and ownership in your team. So bringing more people into the process, that inclusivity that the Secretary was discussing, strengthening your culture so people are willing to offer those different points of view. And then one of that I think is really going to scratch the itch for folks, scenario planning. So tips to help you pivot successfully when you're dealing with uncertainty. That was the most popular poll question from today. So that we are building steps 4 or 5 and 6 right now. Step 5 will be completed. That module will be completed May 1st. Step 6, module 6 will be completed by May 15th. Then we got a bonus module, building resilience. So how you build greater resilience for your team in this time of crisis. And some of the things that you get through this course, of course, you get the complete step-by-step process. You also get 7 one-hour online sessions with the SLA team to answer whatever questions you've got during this crisis, whether they're course-related matters or other leadership issues. Unlimited email access to us during your 7 weeks in session. 24/7 lifetime access to the course. Bonus content. So we got a bonus module we'll be populating with ebooks and other resources. And of course, we've got full support to answer any of your questions. And then you can select a VIP option where you also get a private 1-hour call with one of us to discuss your crisis action plans, and particularly how you're going to pivot to the future. I really appreciate everybody being with us today. So you can just send me an email to ask me more about the course if you wish, or just go to the web page down below, Strategic Leaders Academy, teachable.com, leading through the COVID crisis, and you've got it right there. So our next 30-minute Thursday is going to be with the Honorable Michelle Flournoy, who is the CEO of WestExec and the former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. So another leadership rock star to be with us on May 9th, and everybody will be getting an invitation for that one as well. So once again, Mr. Johnson, I really appreciate you being here with us. I appreciate everybody who's participated, and I look forward to seeing everybody on May 9th. I'll stand by for a couple minutes for questions in the chat.
Chris, can you hear me?
I can.
I sent you a speaker idea for a future date. She is the police chief of a moderate-sized city They had a mass shooting, and she is, I believe, credited, and her police force, with responding to the crisis very effectively. So, and I met her at a conference about a year and a half ago. Was very impressed that before that incident, and so you might want to do some research on her.
Okay, perfect. I really appreciate that. I'll do
Okay.
that, and then yeah, hopefully be able to have her on the program.
Okay. All right, Chris. Signing off.
All right. Thanks.